very excited to get started and talk about hosting a podcast. And this is one of the most common questions I get with new clients here at the Podcast Consultant, probably existing clients as well, especially shows in their first year or so, because hosting is a bit of an intimidating new thing. Most of our clients are business owners or executives, leaders in business, and they're probably used to things like being a professional who maybe speaks at meetings and conferences and events and things. But being a podcast host is a little bit different. And so today, what I wanted to do is get together with Colby Donovan, one of our longtime friends and clients, and Mathew Passy, founder of the Podcast Consultant. And I'll let you guys do your longer intros. But y'all know a ton about this sort of world of hosting, both from learning the hard way, as Colby and I were chatting about and joking about before, and professional experience, Mathew, in your case. So excited to get into this. Let's go ahead and do a quick round of intros. Colby, how about you kick us off?
Happy to say the best for last. So I'm Colby Donovan. I'm the director of investment content for Cambria Investment Management. We have publicly traded ETFs. So very finance investee. Part of my job is producing a podcast for our CEO, and then I also co-host. And when I say produce, I don't mean what these gentlemen do. I mean more of handling, coordinating, and everything. I don't know the right word for that, but I call it producer sometimes. And then I also co-host episodes for the CFA Society of Orlando podcast and kind of help coordinate edits and that sort of thing too, as well with these gentlemen. So that's kind of a lower level than the day job one. And then for fun, I used to do another one around coaching, and that was just me for fun and like the most low key, low budget one. So I've kind of worked with these gentlemen on three different tiers of levels of sophistication and seriousness, and
Yeah,
learned plenty from
three-time
them.
repeat client. So either we're doing
Yeah,
something right, or Colby just keeps falling for it. No.
maybe both.
Mathew, I know a lot of the attendees will know you well, but give us your quick intro.
Sure. As many of you might know, I'm the former owner and the founder of the Podcast Consultant. So I've definitely had a lot of experience working on podcasts and working with podcasts. Prior to that, I worked in radio for about 11 years, first at a talk station in New Jersey, and then for the Wall Street Journal Radio Network. So I've had my fair share of being behind a microphone, both very successfully and sometimes very, very miserably. So excited to share from both the good and the bad.
Fantastic. Great. Yeah. And I'm Karl Hughes, CEO and now owner of the Podcast Consultant. Have worked with Mathew and Colby now for the last year. Actually, Mathew, I guess we kind of worked together through the sale for a year, and then we've been working together, since then, kind of passing around work and staying in touch. And I'm learning from Mathew every day. So good to have you guys here. Today, what we're going to go through are a few kind of hot topics. What I sort of did here was put together some of the most common questions that come up as I'm leading onboardings and new client launches when it comes to hosting. So the first one is around planning and strategy, coming up with a good flow of conversation, planning out questions. Then we'll talk about actually conducting the interview. That's kind of the meat of the conversation, how to actually go back and forth. We'll also talk about some of the technical things like the equipment, how close your microphone should be. Mine's probably a bit far, Mathew would tell me. I always, debate that. How close do I get to my face? Is it going to be right up here or a little further? So let's talk about that. And then coaching and working with guests, because one of the other interesting variables in our space is that most of the guests are not professional media people. So unlike in some mediums with podcasting, you're often going to find guests who are trying to figure this out for the first time as well. So what can we do to help make them better? Like I said at the beginning, we'll have a live Q&A at the end. So if you've got questions, I'll try to save about 15 minutes to the end for us to do that. But if we don't get to your question or you have things you think about afterwards, again, feel free to follow up via email. We're always very available for this. So I'll cut off my screen share so we can have a little more FaceTime, and let's get into it, guys. So let's talk about the basics first. People, who are brand new to podcasting, which a lot of our clients, when they start with us, they're first time podcasters. They've maybe been on a show or they've listened to podcasts for a long time. What are the very first things that they should know about being a host? If you're going to, go from listener or maybe guest on a podcast occasionally to hosting a show, what's different? What do they need to keep in mind first?
one of the first things you need to keep in mind is that just because you are great at talking doesn't mean you are great at talking into a microphone. For some reason, when you put this device in front of somebody's face, or you put this device in front of somebody's face, everybody tends to kind of freak out and panic, or try to put on an act, try to put on my radio personality voice. And in broadcasting, that might be a little bit more effective, right? It's a kind of a different medium. But what really makes for a great podcasting host is authenticity and having that sense of intimacy with the listener. So one of the pieces of advice I've always given, and some of you have probably heard this before, is, in broadcasting, you are trying to reach 1,000 people at once. But in podcasting, your objective should really be to reach one person 1,000 times. And so, we always say, treat this camera, treat this microphone as a person, not an avatar, not some 30-year-old white male from California who likes surfing. No, no, no. This is my buddy Paul, right? Because when I talk to Paul, my shoulders are up, I'm excited, I'm leaning in, I'm smiling, I'm enthusiastic. And also, I'm not overthinking it. I'm just talking as if I'm, at a coffee shop or at a bar, talking with my friend. And so if you can kind of host without thinking about hosting, that's kind of the first way to really get yourself in a good mindset.
Yeah. Colby, you were kind of a beginner at this and, not too long ago, I guess. So like, what would you say were some of the first things you learned about being a host on, being on this side of the mic, or maybe just observing people as they've learned to be hosts?
I think, like Matthew said, it is not funny when it's you or you're on the episode, but when, you do this for the first time, it feels like you're like giving a presentation at, Madison Square Garden with after Kanye West performed or something. It can be a little overwhelming, but I think, just like you said, just acting like it's you and whoever you're talking to. And I think the thing I see is when someone's doing a podcast they're interested in or care about, like, it just comes off more natural because they don't have to think about it as much. Like, if I'm doing an episode on sewing, I don't know, like, if I have to do that, I don't know anything about that. That's not my cup of tea. I'm not particularly interested in it. And I think it comes off that way. So I think making sure, if you're going to do this, it's about a topic you care about, I think helps negate all of that awkwardness and uncertainty at first. And I think probably I wish when I had started, I had done with someone I know casually, like an episode just for the sake of it, to,
Yep.
And listen to yourself back, which even now I'm like, this is painful. I don't want to listen. Like, I hate listening after I record to like go through and find like timestamp edits that need to be made. But it's helpful to do. And you kind of can realize afterwards that you talk, you fumble, and you like, and I listen, but once you have those reps and do this, the camera doesn't feel like as big of a deal. So I think just making sure that if you do launch one and start one, you're interested in it, helps get you over the hump. Making sure you're not just doing this to do this because your competitor's doing it, or because, maybe your boss is telling you have to do it, you don't have a choice. But, I think that helps a lot.
Yeah,
one thing also that a lot of podcasters, we are focused on this part of the process, and especially with a lot of the clients of the podcast consultant, naturally, the format is primarily to interview other people. And so we are overly concerned about what we're going to say, but really some of the best podcast hosts we ever work with are great because they are great listeners. And you will find that some of the best podcasts you listen to, you only hear from the host for like 10% of that time. But the folks who are really paying attention, who are not just waiting for their turn to speak, who aren't just going through a number of questions line by line and ignoring the responses, they're the ones who create the most compelling conversations, because that's what it is. It's a conversation. It's a back and forth. And you really have to be paying attention to the other person to engage effectively.
Yeah, you don't want to hear the guest say something like, the world is going to end tomorrow. And
so what'd you have for breakfast, Colby?
This exact. And then you ask the next question on your list, and it just feels so, the guest feels off. It feels off listening to it. Like, you want to be able to, it's a nice balance of having a list of questions you want to talk to about with also listening and being willing to veer off course if they say something interesting.
Yeah, for sure. I like your idea, Colby, about having some practice episodes, or at least one or two that you actually record and actually listen back to, just to get a sense of what you're your weird verbal tics are, or the things you do that are annoying to you, because it's probably annoying to other listeners. And obviously you can clean up a lot of stuff in post-production, but at the same time, like if you can start to think about those things and just, again, get it to a point where it feels comfortable enough to have it like a, a two-way conversation or three-way conversation that we're having here, it gets a lot easier, and and then a lot of those little problems work themselves out. Kind of going beyond the very basics, like that's, obviously practice is probably the biggest thing you guys are saying here, is like you're just going to need to do this over and over till it feels just natural as part of this, and also just like, loosen up a little and get into a conversation. That's all great. Like, what does the really advanced host, the people who are legitimately professional hosts, what do they do that the sort of mid-range hosts, the people who've maybe had their own podcast for a couple of years, but they're not, like, they've never taken training in this, like, what are those final things you do to tweak that top 20% or whatever it is? And Mathew, maybe you have some thoughts here, being in, having been in radio, you've probably heard some really good people, and I think you've probably been that really good host. Like, what would you say?
The number one thing that you will find from really great hosts versus those that are lower to middle tier is preparation. Once you are
Oh, my answer. Come on.
Once you are adequately prepared for a conversation, it gives you a sense of confidence going into it. And that confidence is what's really going to make you more effective, more comfortable, more natural, more authentic sounding. And even on those podcasts that are a adventure of curiosity, where the whole point is for you to learn what is happening, is to examine this person, go through their background, see what makes them tick, see what they're doing and exciting. You still have to, know where are the spots that I'm going to get the most from this person? Where are the places that, my audience is going to get the most value from who I'm talking to? So one is definitely preparation. Two is environment.
Yeah.
I'm sure many of the hosts in here have had a guest who, didn't put the microphone on correctly, took the interview in the middle of their living room with the kids jumping around and the dogs barking. Some people have taken it walking. I remember at the Journal, we interviewed the head of Huffington Post at one point. She literally took the call as she was getting in an elevator and thought that was adequate. And we lost her for 90% of the interview. But as a host, right, you need to have a zone that you're not distracted. You turn off your notifications. You've got your material prepped in front of you. Everything is plugged in, right? You just want to be comfortable and well prepared to do everything. And truthfully, as boring as it is, Carl, practice and, repetition is the only way to really get there in many cases.
Colby, how much time do you spend on that preparation topic, like prepping for a show? And obviously there's a range here, because some shows maybe take a little less if it's a little more casual or a kind of, lower impact show. Others is going to be more like, and walk me through some of that prep work that you would do or you would recommend to hosts to do.
Like you said, it ranges, excuse me, but I think, like, for a guest that for the show I produce for work, the Meb Faber Show tomorrow, I'll pull up any interviews he's done before to try to listen to. And I mean, some people are like on the interview circuit and have done 500.
Right.
I mean, I don't need to listen to them 500 times. I'll try to listen to a couple times, read any papers they've done, or find background information, find like as many little interesting tidbits to pull for the episode. So it just depends on the guest. But I think I don't think I've ever done an episode without prepping for at least like 3 hours. And that includes, I think, like listening to it. Like if you listen to an hour episode they've done, that's an hour. But I do think it is, if you don't prep, it's going to come through because you're more knowledgeable, but you know which threads to pull on when you do more prep. And then you also have more knowledge about the guest for when they say something, about them. And that may differ from what the perception of them is, and you can pull on that thread because you're more knowledgeable. And without that, I think it comes across as more stale and like you're going through a list of questions because you haven't like done the background. And I mean, if someone hasn't done an episode before and it's like your friend, obviously it's a lot easier to do that kind of thing, and you probably don't need to prep as much because you know the person and you know those things already. So
I always love when a host has clearly done their homework on a guest and they've like either read a deep cut from their blog or book or something and like they pull out some kind of esoteric piece of knowledge about this person. They like, bring it up and like, because I agree with you, Colby, like sometimes you'll hear people who are on this interview circuit and I'll be listening to my regular cycle of podcasts and they come up, the same person comes up 3 or 4 times, in a month. And I'm like, okay, this guy's on a PR run, which is fine. But I love when a
Yeah.
certain host will kind of like dig in and get into something a little off that path where I can like, really, it's really a lot more interesting.
And I think the guests appreciate when that happens. And that's a great point by you of like, if you, let's say they wrote a book, if you can say, you had a quote in the book and I'm going to read it to you. I love that it was blah, blah, blah. Like, why do you think that? I think that shows through to the listeners that you're taking it seriously. It's going to be a better question and answer. And I think the guest also appreciates it because it shows you did your homework instead of them just thinking you did. And then they're more engaged as a result of that.
Yeah. Yeah, we're gonna let's dive in a little more to this guest bit because I think we'll come back to the equipment discussion and technical stuff here in a second. But since we're on this topic, what do you find is helpful when you're picking guests or sort of like approving guests for the show, Colby? Are there certain things you're looking for? Obviously, like you want people who are, I guess, well known ideally, but like there's other things too that can make a good guest. Like what would kind of like factor into your mind?
There's a lot. I mean, you can want to have on, like, we're a finance podcast. It'd be great if Warren Buffett wanted to come on. He's not going to, so okay. But like that would get a ton of downloads for us. It would be great. But also having a guest that maybe doesn't have a huge following and isn't well known, but for whatever reason, us doing an episode with him hits our target audience really well. That is important. And I think people sometimes always want to jump to how can I get the more downloads? Like more downloads is what I need. And there, like Mathew said, there are very few people that are going to have a show with 1 million downloads an episode. Sometimes it's talking to the same person 1,000 times. I think also trying to get a gist of, especially in the finance world, there are a lot of, I mean, I think I'm this way a lot of the times, introverted, nerdy finance people who aren't doing sales and out speaking and media and that sort of thing. So if it's possible, you want to try to see before you reach out and schedule them, or if they're an inbound person and they want to come on your show, to try to make sure that they're a well-spoken person and aren't awkward when they speak and very, robotic. Like people want to hear an exciting conversation and your voice moving and all those sorts of things and be engaged and not just a robot sitting there talking like this. So if you can try to figure that out in advance and make sure you don't have that episode happen by accident, that's always helpful.
Yeah. And anecdotally, I just did an audit last week with a client who their most downloaded episode was one with just the two co-hosts talking. There wasn't even a guest there, even though they've had some really good high profile guests that were super interesting. It's funny how like you kind of have to look at the numbers and see what resonates with people. And sometimes it's not what you'd expect. It's not necessarily the highest profile people that bring in the biggest audiences. Mathew, in your experience, I mean, again, you've seen a lot of shows and a lot of what works and doesn't in guest selection. Like, what are some of the things to think about when you're a host sort of prepping your guest lineup or you're kind of getting together with your team to figure that out?
Well, I'm gonna tackle this from the other perspective first, which is the one thing I don't want to do is I don't want to pick guests because of their potential impact on the growth of the show.
Mm.
A lot of people, they're going to say, oh, I've really got to get Karl Hughes on my podcast because he has this huge social media following. And, you're going to annoy Karl and just keep going until you get him on the show. And it turns out, yeah, Karl will do it, but he's just like, okay, whatever. And you've put all the stress, all this energy, all this, angst on this one person. And it turns out, one, because they're not that excited to be on the show, they don't give you a good performance. Two, they didn't actually share it with their audience anyway, so you didn't get the benefit of them being on the show. And three, you're all despondent and disappointed because it didn't go the way you wanted it to. And that could lead to people getting frustrated and pod fading and all sorts of things like that. So I don't, it's not a good tactic to chase someone down to be on your podcast if they don't want to be. Not worth it, right? It's just, you want the best people on your show, the people who are going to be excited to be on, who are going to deliver value. and frankly, who are relevant to your niche or relevant to the tone and the focus of the show that you are putting on. I even go back to with Patrick O'Shaughnessy in the beginning of Invest Like the Best. Obviously, in the beginning, lots of investor focused folks, lots of Wall Street based folks. But then he would bring on these really interesting characters like, the guy who runs the Jungle Reserve in South Africa. And you're like, what does that have to do with investing? And you listen to the conversations like it's not about investing, but it's about you. It's investing your time. It's how you invest, your efforts into things. And so, yeah, not strictly a money person, but still relevant to the value that you are promising to deliver to your audience. So
Yeah.
I'd rather have a great guest than somebody with a great audience be on my show. Number two is to try and, not make it feel like a very formal event. Even going back to what we were saying in the beginning, you look at this microphone, all of a sudden you go, oh, 10 people going to be on a podcast. You've got to convey that sentiment to your guest as well. And, I always do that I always try and break the ice a little bit with a little bit of a joke. We say, hey, don't worry, this conversation's being recorded. So if you stumble over your words or, if I ask a stupid question, right, like, just tell us and someone will clean it up later. And right, getting them to laugh, getting them to kind of understand that this is going to be fun and easy and somebody is going to listen and fix it or edit it later. And, everything they say isn't going to be on air live is also going to kind of loosen them up a little bit. And hopefully within a few minutes, they also forget that there's a microphone in front of them and they're talking casually with you.
Right.
So, it really is about getting the right guests, which again is about who is going to be best for your audience or best for your goals, and then getting them to be comfortable. It's also the reason why if you want to do an hour with someone, schedule 90 minutes because tech issues are going to happen. Or even if tech issues don't happen, right, there's always a little pre-show chatter. Oh, so thank you for coming on. This is so great. I read your book, blah, blah, blah. And even afterwards, especially if you're using this for networking, you want that time after the call to say to the person, man, that was really great. Can I tell you this quick story or can we, exchange information? Right. You don't want the person to jump on, have tech issues, only have 15 minutes to talk. And then you say, all right, thanks for joining me. Click, they're gone. Because you haven't gotten anything out of it then.
Yeah.
This is a really good one. And it actually kind of dovetails into what I was going to ask you guys about next, which is tech issues. So this is interesting because like as the host, so some shows we work with obviously have like a host and then a producer like Colby sitting in the background kind of like going to help out if anything goes wrong, right? And that's great. Some shows don't have that. Some shows work with us. We've got, remote engineers that'll join. That's great too. But like there's at the end of the day, a lot of times the host kind of has to just take the reins. And that's one of your jobs, I think, as a host that maybe gets underplayed or you wouldn't really think about. But like as a host, what are some of the equipment issues that you notice, whether it's on the host side, the guest side, a little of both? I know, Matthew, one of the first things that you told me when we first met was that microphone needs to be closer to your face. So I, try to use this metric now. But what else is there on the equipment side that we can think about? Things that, maybe we weren't. Matthew, this is probably the best question for you, but I'll ask you as well, Colby.
Man, I don't know if we have enough time for all of these, but I'll
a whole
narrow
nother
down
webinar,
to
right?
a few of the top three.
Yeah.
One is, of course, any equipment that you're using, double check the inputs and the outputs. That's why I love using Riverside, for example, because it allows me as the host to see what that person is using. And so they could say, oh, I've got my, Samson Q2U plugged in, and you can see it says AirPods is the microphone. Can we fix that? Right. So having some, having a view into what they're doing is good. If you can't, having them kind of do like a little scratch test on the microphone, that's always good. Maybe one of these while they're talking, right? If the volume of their voice doesn't change, then they're not using the right input. So checking your inputs and outputs with the person right away is probably one of the most fundamental things you need to do for yourself and for your guest. So it's kind of like golf, right? You have to have like your pre-swing routine, right? And that should include the things that you do and the things that they do. The second thing, of course, is connectivity issues. And, when possible, wired internet is obviously the best. If not, if somebody is on wireless or if their thing is struggling, like shut down everything else you can on the other device, right? Close all the tabs, close all the programs, just minimize what is taking resources from the computer so that your connection to each other can be as robust as possible. And of course, the third one and the most important one, and the one that we always hear, and every podcaster makes this mistake at least once, but usually only once, you have to press record.
Right.
That I cannot tell you how many times working at the Journal, recording a podcast or doing an interview, I'm like, oh, that was fantastic. And I look down and I go, oh, beep. So, sometimes just hitting record right away so you don't have to think about it is good.
Yeah.
Or again, having like a checklist, or maybe on your script, it says hit record. Hi, I'm Mathew. Welcome to the podcast, right? Like just, you can't share it if you didn't capture it.
Actually, this is a good, maybe this like is a related question for you, Colby, but like, I'm curious here if you've had any like experiences where it really like went off the rails tech wise, and how you kind of recovered that, or anything like that you've picked up, being in that producer seat or the host seat.
We've had, I think sometimes it's, at least it was for me at first, it's hard. Like, I'd love to say I'm fabulous, but there are a lot of guests where they're famous or well known within the industry, and I would say above where I'm at.
Sure.
Pretty much everyone is. So can be hard to be like, hey, Matt, like, if Matthew's ready to go and locked it, like, hey, Mathew, can you actually tap your mic for me? Oh, it's not working. Can you, like, that can be
a hard
awkward thing, right? to do it first, but you got to do it because it's better for them. It's better for you. If there's an issue after, you find out afterwards, there are things you can do, but there are things that can't be fixed, and you don't want to deal with that. So you want to try to nip it in the butt on the front end and try to do those checks and make sure and set up, as many dummy ways of making sure things get recorded as possible. Like, we have my boss's Zoom set up where when he gets on Zoom, it automatically begins recording no matter what, which, like, great. We don't have to worry about remembering that. And we do a backup recording too, but at least that we know if we're on Zoom is going that way. There have been times where we've had a guest who was in Puerto Rico using Starlink for his Wi-Fi, and it crapped out halfway through the episode, and then we started over. We had to wait 20 minutes for the episode to upload to the cloud, and then we started back, and the second time it didn't record the video. And so, like, in the future, I would have tried to figure something else out with Starlink. I don't know what. That's why I reach out to you guys and ask you questions once a week. But I think as many times as you can, trying to figure things out in the front end, even if it's a call ahead of time, like the day before, of, hey, we're hopping on. We're going to make sure this recording works. We're going to make sure your mic works. How it's plugged in right. The button's turned on. There was one thing I was just going to say too.
But similar to that,
with Riverside too, the one thing I was going to say is, if you use Riverside, we always try to do like a tech check where I record for 5 seconds, start record, end record, and make sure it can upload to the cloud. I'd say 1 out of 20, it won't work on their computer for whatever reason. So just do that beforehand, so you don't have that 1 out of 20 happen.
Right. Yeah. I always tell clients as they're setting up their first interviews, like, use Riverside. It's absolutely the going to get you best quality, and you want to like default to that, but like have a backup method to communicate with that guest, whether you've got their phone number, you can call them if something, their internet drops and you want to just record a phone call. That could, look, if you've got this person only once for this 1 hour, that's serviceable, or at least you can communicate with them. If if the person is not as like tech forward, maybe you just have a Zoom call or Microsoft Teams call ready that you could just like default to. That way, if worst case, you can kind of go record there if they know those mediums better. And it's not, again, like, you're kind of gonna do this like dance of, well, I want better quality, but at the end of the day, I also really want this interview, and I want this person to feel like they didn't waste their time with me. So there's always nice to be over prepared rather than under prepared. Anything on the related topic of like helping guests out, do you guys typically recommend, and do you, Colby, maybe send any kind of like prep for the guest? Do you have like a template email? A lot of our clients do that, so I'm curious how you've handled that.
Yeah, I have an email with, it's the length of the First Testament that we'll send out of, this is recorded on video as well as audio. If that's an issue, let us know. Please, if you don't have a microphone, let me know. Sometimes we'll send it to a guest. Sometimes the guest wants me to recommend one for them. I'll tell them to use headphones. I'll give them a heads up of a lot of podcasts have, a closing question they ask every episode, or closing questions. Sometimes I'll tell them that in advance. I try to communicate all that as much as possible. And then I also will say, sometimes for the Meb Faber Show podcast, we will have the guests do a tech check with us, unless it's like you said, the example of, hey, you got this person. If you want it for an hour next week on Tuesday at 9 o'clock, take it or leave it. If that's what it is,
Right.
sometimes that's what it is. But trying to give as much information on the front end, and then be willing to follow up with them if they don't respond, and say like, hey, I just want to be sure you read through this, because I don't know the number of times where I've told that the guest gets on and afterwards they're like, oh, I didn't know that was on video. And
Mm-hmm.
like, I've emailed you that twice and I said it, at the beginning, but the guest doesn't know. And sometimes they're just going looking at their notes or something, and then afterwards don't know. So again, I think over communicating on the front end, because a lot of the time this is just like, it's nervous or nerve wracking to launch a show and host it for the first time. A lot of times for a guest, this is their first or second time being on a show, and it's new for them,
Totally,
and
yeah.
they're just as nervous as you. So trying to make it seem casual and calm them down beforehand, say, this is not live, this is the most editable thing in the world, and be kind of their psychologist. Someone said once that after every episode, Oprah said after every interview she does, the guest, no matter who it is, like president, whoever, always says like, how did I do? And I've
Yeah.
seen that too, where guests always say like, how did I do? And for a lot of people, I'm like, you are you, like, you are a big deal. You, of course, were fine. But everyone's nervous about that. Just like I'm
Yeah.
nervous to host an episode or something. Everyone wants to do well. So if you can make them feel relaxed, whether that's just talking to them casually beforehand, or giving them as much information as possible so they're not surprised by
Yeah.
anything, I think is helpful.
Yeah, I also tend to ask our editors when I record a video or I'm a guest on a podcast, I'll ask the editor of the show, like, how did I do? What could I do better? Because they watch hundreds of shows all the time, right?
Yeah.
And of course, they're not expert interviewers, experts on the topic area, but like they can at least give me some of that tactical stuff. Because look, I'm not a professional interviewer. This is something I do on the side occasionally, and I want to get better at it. Like, like you say, it's even a high profile guest. I think they realize they want to be better at this too. So if people ask for feedback, certainly give it. And if you want feedback as a host or a guest, I would say ask it from your editors, from the other person in the episode with you. Mathew, anything else to add on the like helping your guests be more successful? Do you actually? This is one question specifically for you that somebody asked me the other day, and I have opinions about, but I want to hear your opinions. Um, do you send your guests a full list of questions or talking points, or do you try to just send them maybe one, that final one, like Colby mentioned, or do you send them, no questions and just tell them we're going to talk about what we talk about? Like, what's your opinion on that?
I prefer not to send questions. What we have found is not everyone, but there are enough people who, if you send them the questions, they will plan and or script their answers, and then you don't have an authentic
Right.
conversation. And then if you get an answer and you try and follow up with them, you kind of throw them off because they're off their script. So I don't like them having that. I'm okay with sending them a few topics, or at least what
Yeah.
I would say like ideas of what we might explore. But again, I try and keep it open ended. So I'll say, yeah, like on podcasting tech, yeah, we'll talk about your software, how it works, and then a few questions about the podcasting industry as a whole. Right. So
Yeah.
nothing that they can really overly prepare for, but also nothing that when they get there, be like, I didn't know you were going to ask me about podcasting.
Right.
You should.
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, I'm not a fan of the pre-sending of the questions.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think setting the direction of the conversation is most helpful. And this has been true on the guest side too. Like, I don't necessarily need to know the exact questions you're going to ask. In fact, I kind of want you to, be a little dynamic with it as a host. But I do want to know, should I prep in my own mind, like thinking about, when I maybe starting a business, which is very different from buying a business, which is different from owning and operating, scaling a business. And like, I want to kind of know what direction are we heading this conversation so I can kind of like think about my key talking points and the things I've experienced, and maybe at least have myself like on that mindset, and maybe like who the audience is that's going to be receiving this and things like that. So yeah. Okay, let's talk video, because this has come up more and more. It's been wild. This last year when, I was just getting started working with Mathew, a pretty small, relatively small percentage of shows coming in were video. And this year it's been 50-50 like new shows are coming in a video. I would say a lot of our clients, existing clients, are talking about converting to video shows now. And not every show does it make sense, or some, some will have a different workflow for video, or some will just do some episodes in video. But like, as a host, what are some of the things that I need to think about when it comes to a video show versus an audio only show? And maybe there's some obvious ones and some less obvious ones. Mathew, what comes to mind? Anything that you've seen when it comes to either, taking a show to video, or starting a show video instead of audio?
There's a lot more that you have to think about. And
Mm.
not that I'm this vain, but for some people, it's really, do I need to wear some sort of makeup? Do
Sure.
I have good lighting in my house for this?
Yeah.
Am I dressed appropriately for this? So you do think about going into it a little bit differently, because there are aesthetics at play. What does my background look like, right? Is it cool enough, or is it boring, or, is there something in the background that's inappropriate, which I took off the desk right before we started this webinar? Sure. Right. You have to think about it a little bit more, but more importantly, it's also, what are you doing during the interview? I have this tendency to either take a lot of notes, or, my ADD brain, like I can easily get distracted. And so the problem with that is that, I'm asking Carl a question. He gives me this answer. While he's answering, I'm over here being like,
Right. Not a good look.
right. And Carl's sitting there like, does he actually care? Why am I talking to this person? He's not really listening. So you have to kind of, be more attentive to what you are doing on camera. Unless you are able to, kind of preface say, hey, listen, I will look down. I'm still listening, just taking notes. But,
Mm-hmm.
You are giving off a lot of visual, physical cues. And so you have to be mindful of that. If I'm doing an audio interview and somebody says something silly, I can roll my eyes. Well, they can't hear that mostly. Right. But, visually, Carl says something silly and I go, right. He knows, and that could really disrupt the flow of a good conversation.
Well, and that brings up an interesting challenge, which is some of that stuff doesn't convert to audio. So then what do? When the show is going to be distributed on video and audio? It's like, it's interesting. I hear this often with shows I'm listening to, that maybe their first format they go out to is YouTube, and then they kind of have a podcast as well. And they'll have a lot of visual gags, or visual kind of like tells and things. And it's like, well, we're leaving the audio listeners behind. I don't know how y'all think about that. And Colby, maybe you have some thoughts there. I don't know how visual your shows necessarily get, but what have you guys learned about, getting into video and recording the video and things?
The first thing is, sadly, I think it's what people should do if they can. I think sadly it introduces more tech issues, or the potential of more tech issues,
Sure.
which can be hard. And you want to make sure your camera's good. I mean, mine's not looking as good as it could right now, but I bought a camera for this, and I would move the water bottles off of my shoulder right here, and the book. You want to have a nice background and
I
not
thought you
have
might be like
your.
an investor in Aquafina or something. If you got shares, you're just trying to plug them a little bit there.
I
I'm
thought that
not
was just the
the.
waiting room.
I'm in the doctor's office. But you want to make sure that looks right, and the
Mhm.
same thing for the guests. Again, you want to tell them beforehand, this is video, so they know, because guests will, as I would if I was in their shoes, want to make sure that their office looks nice and they don't have paper stacked to the ceiling. We had one guest recently, huge hedge fund manager, super successful. He was cleaning out his office. He had like he had a huge office. He literally had an industrial sized garbage can in the background. And politely I said, hey, Mathew, that is in the video, so just want you to know if you want to move it. And politely, then they'll move it. So you want to look out for people too, so they are proud of the outcome and those sorts of things. But it definitely introduces more things that can go wrong, but I think it's really, really helpful and a good thing to do. But you just want to, again, communicate with the guest about it and make sure your setup is right, so at the very least, if something goes wrong or there's an issue, yours is all set up beforehand.
Going back to the original question of what do you do about the audio versus video, 3 years ago, if you had asked me that question, and when I did audits for this, I would have said to someone, you're doing a lot of visual stuff on an audio medium, and it's not really effective, or, vice versa. You're thinking about the podcast, but you're not giving the audience that's viewing your show anything interesting to watch. And, you're not going to maintain retention, things like that. These days, most content creators are, distributing in multiple platforms.
Yeah.
most of the audience understands that. Most of the audience is attuned to that.
Mhm.
They're less judgy about those sort of things. So, I would focus on my visual first because, right, you can't mask a lot of visual things as well as you can
Mhm.
mask audio issues. But try to be cognizant of that. So if you are doing something like, talking about a chart, well, then yeah, think about your audio audience and say, we'll put a link to that chart, or
Right.
go to this website to see the chart or something like that, just so they have an opportunity to still follow along. Like, don't ignore them, but don't drive yourself crazy worrying about the other audience as well.
Yeah.
And
That's
there'll be
good.
certain things you have to make a call on. Like we have told the team when editing, like when in doubt, cut more likes, those sorts of things, so it sounds good for audio than video right now. Because we get
Hmm.
on average mostly like 10 times the amount of listeners on audio than video. We still want the video to be a good product and everything, but at the end of the day, I'd rather the video be choppy than audio have more ums and ahs and those sorts of things. But that's it may change in the future, but you just have to think about that. Like Matthew said, there's a trade-off as you go.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, let's get into some listener questions or viewer questions, I suppose, since they're not just listening. And we had a few people send in some, and then I've got some more that we'd collected beforehand. People were curious about things we were going to ask, so got some questions here. The first one, which we didn't talk about yet, which I think is a cool topic, because this has come up a couple times this year where clients want to have in-person interviews, whether they are building out a studio space or they're going to go on location and do recordings for interviews, which that provides a lot of challenges, but I'm curious to hear you guys' thoughts on like differences or best practices around doing these like in-person interviews. Is there anything else to keep in mind as a host?
I mean, if you have the opportunity to do in person, go for it. There is
Hmm.
nothing better. The chemistry is better. The opportunity for things to go wrong is dramatically reduced. You're always just going to have a better interaction with someone who is in the room with you.
Yeah.
Now, that said, it brings on its other complications, which is somebody's got to bring equipment to that person. Two schedules have to line up. Obviously, if Meb is out in Colorado or California, wherever he is these days, and I'm in New Jersey, getting to him is not going to be as easy. Whereas we could jump on a Riverside call in the next 10 minutes and doing conversation. So, the limitations are obviously there, but if you can, if it's easy, if it's conducive, in person is always going to be better.
Yeah. Colby, have you guys done any in-person interviews?
Meb did before COVID, which is pre me, and then I
Yeah.
did one in-person interview in February 2020, and everything else has been virtual since. I think doing it, I would love for more to be in person,
Yeah.
but if I'm doing it with somebody, I'm in Palm Beach Gardens, Florida, South Florida. I work in my bedroom. Like I don't have a studio to go to record. Like that's not going to happen, even if someone lives across the street. But I do think it
Yeah.
brings a level of professionalism, and I think it also makes the guest aware that you take it seriously. Like it just feels more serious when it's in person, and I think the guest like elevates their game a little bit because of that.
It's
Yeah.
also easier to
That's
stay
really, yeah.
focused. You're not hiding
Yeah,
behind a
yeah,
screen, right? It's like, oh,
Yeah,
somebody
yeah,
there. No,
totally.
yeah,
And
you have to look
it
at them.
it feels more natural. Back to the point we were talking at the very, very
yeah.
beginning. Like honestly, it's a struggle sometimes when I'm either a guest on a show or having a conversation. Even not like this one. This one's been fun, but like some of the some of the discussions I've led on the internet, I go, oh my gosh, am I like, can I move on and check my email yet? Is it done? Like, and you don't want to be like that, but in person it's like impossible to be like that. And I'm never like
Mhm.
that. But behind a screen, you've got so many flashers and things moving around. It's like easy to get distracted. Um, another thing that came up here in the questions, which we didn't get to, and I think this kind of is a whole other area of discussion, is sort of the like vocal part of being a host. So the question was, any recommendations for developing a great voice to listen to, like exercises to develop good elocution, intonation, pace of delivery? This is a great question. I don't know the answer to this. I have done a lot of public speaking, and often the advice was just go slower than you think is reasonably slow, which maybe that applies in podcasting. But Matthew, any thoughts from your side?
Yeah, I mean, I'm definitely not a vocal coach, so I know there are exercises that you can do, right, to get your enunciation to be better, to get your speed to be better. Maybe if you have a thick accent to kind of minimize that.
Yeah.
Uh, I I've never really done a lot of those things, so I'm not going to speak to that. I will say, definitely drink plenty of water before you're about to interview, and truthfully, at any time, like that's going to help. And then the other thing is, part of what you want to do is project. And a lot of people think projecting means I have to be louder. And like, you can be confident and project and convey what you're thinking without being louder. So it really is just, again, about being comfortable, which comes from being prepared, being confident, knowing what you're going to do, being okay, being ready, having good chemistry or relationship with a person, because the other thing is a lot of people go into this very timidly. Like, I promise you, in many cases, the guest is more timid or more afraid of how this is going to go than you are, right? They're at the firing squad. You're peppering them with the questions. So as long as you can be comfortable, relaxed, confident, enjoy yourself, you'll come across just fine. Don't worry. Do I have the right voice for radio? Who cares? Your voice is your voice. We want to hear your authentic voice. People with weird voices tend to be the most successful because they stand out, right? You hear a voice and go, oh, I know exactly who that is, as opposed to generic white man voice over here, right? So don't worry about any of that. When you hear your voice, as Colby was talking about earlier, you're going to hate it. That is science. When you talk, you hear your voice rattling around in your brain off your bones. When you hear it on a podcast, you're actually hearing it in your ears. So your brain is like, who the hell is that? And that makes you not like it. So nobody's going to like the sound of their voice. Get over it. And again, just you don't have to shout. This is the other reason why. Get that microphone really nice and close to you, right? Many of you have heard this, intimate but not weird with that microphone. This way, you don't have to be loud. You don't have to shout. You don't have to strain. You could talk comfortably and the mic will pick it up.
The other thing I would say is I did this. I've probably hosted, I don't know, let's say 100 episodes now. I did this like 2 episodes ago, so it happens. But like, I had the episode close like this, like Mathew does. And during the episode, you naturally will just, so if I'm talking and you kind of will move away and like, you can hear it in the episode, and that's too bad that I did that. I'm an idiot. But like, they are great about telling you when you do that, which I appreciate every time. And I think, you want to tell them, don't hesitate to give me feedback on whatever. But I also think listening to yourself, when I'm going with questions, I can, and I'm thinking through when I'm talking during an episode, I realize listening back, I can sound kind of monotone as I'm just like thinking and just trying to like produce the words. So I'm mindful more now to try to elevate my pitch and, just not be monotone, but also not sound like a freak. But I think, just listening to yourself back, that's why you do one practice episode. You'll pick up on some quirks or tweaks that you do, and you'll learn and move forward. But it's funny, Mathew said that about some people stand out. My favorite finance podcast, the guy he has a very funny sounding voice to me, but it's my favorite one. So I don't think, a voice or a type of pitch necessarily makes or breaks a show.
Right.
I would just, I could see some of the team is in the chat here, so I'm sure many of them are applauding Colby for talking about getting on and off the microphone, and very thankful that you said that.
They're probably like, would he take his own advice, for God's sake?
It's hard. It's like here's the thing. You're trying to be casual and act like, it's a casual conversation. You're trying to be animated because you're on video now and you got to like have a little bit of expressiveness, and you're trying not to back away too far from the mic, and you're trying not to be too close and too loud into it. It's like, there's so many things to think about. And then you're simultaneously trying to have an engaging conversation with a person who you don't get to talk too much. And so like, all in all, I get why it's hard, right? Like we could laugh about the easy mistakes in hindsight. But it's, when you're in it, there's a lot going on. But obviously,
and everyone knows that happens now. Like when this first would happen, I'd freak out. But like, I feel like 5 million people launch a podcast every year. It's normal to.
Every day,
exactly.
every 5 million every second is the latest stat.
We're all used to like hearing those little quirks in episodes now, and like no one's gonna like care.
Well, I'm sure
Yeah.
a lot of people again have heard this before, and I'll always say this at the end of the time, but you have to smile. Even if you're not
Yeah.
recording video,
Yeah.
Yeah.
you have like you can hear the difference in someone's
Mm,
voice when they are excited to be on a podcast versus when they're just there because they have to be there. If you don't
hmm
sound like you want to be there as the host, why in the hell do I want to listen to you?
Yep.
So if
Yep.
you found that you're no longer excited to do it, pivot, change,
Right.
switch out host, do something. But right, your enthusiasm will be infectious to your listener.
No, that's a really good piece of advice. I agree. I think that comes across very clearly to listeners and to hosts. Sometimes they think they're being a little too like effusive or silly or something like that by smiling and kind of having a good time. But we listeners, we want to hear you having a good time. We don't want a show where it's just like downtrodden, sick of being here, like tired of this. Like it's not a good look or listen. That this is kind of related to this, and this is another viewer question, but like, what do we do when something goes wrong and it throws the guest off, and all of a sudden you can tell they're just like uncomfortable, right? And maybe this is just, even if something doesn't go wrong, some guests are just uncomfortable in general. Are there any tricks or things that hosts can do to kind of take the pressure off? Because again, like going back to our very first point, like we want it to be a fun, casual conversation for both sides, and that includes the guest. Guests may not be a pro at this, and so when something throws them off, like maybe you ask a question you weren't supposed to, or they get, they're clearly distracted. What do you do? What do you guys have any tips? Anything that we can take away?
That's such a tough question to answer because I think it really is dependent on who that person is.
Mm,
For me, I usually will combat a situation like that with humor, right? Try
hmm
and get them to laugh, try and get them to relax, try and get them to be a little bit more comfortable. But if I'm talking to some A-list celebrity or someone of monumental importance to me, then I'm probably going to go into very apologetic, you know,
Right.
oh, I'm so sorry, right? Like almost kissing up to them, right? To let them know that I do take this seriously, even though something went wrong. So I don't think there's one answer that works for everybody. You have to be able to read the room a little bit, but the
hmm
best thing eventually what you're looking to do is just get them back to being comfortable, take the pressure off them. So if you've had 20 minutes of tech and you're supposed to go for an hour and you're only going to get 40 minutes, right? Don't worry, we don't have to do an hour, right? We can, we will hit the deadline, right? We will get you off in time to go do your thing, or this is still going to sound great, or the audience is still going to love you. Like we'll get plenty of value. So anything you could do to just kind of not make them worried about what the outcome is going to be. We have a great team of editors that listen to this and take care of it and clean it up. Like it's going to sound great. Don't
Yeah.
worry about it. That's probably the best thing you could do. How you get to that point is going to really be dependent on the person and the situation, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I always try to, like he said, almost be silly in a not awkward way, but just kind of like decompress the situation so they're not as stressed, so they feel more comfortable. And then also just try to relay like competence, like, oh, this has happened before. Don't worry, that actually happened last. Maybe it didn't happen last week, but oh, this happened last week. We just had this happen where we only had a 40-minute episode last week. Not a big deal. Or oh, if we can't see each other during the episode, we do audio only podcasts all the time. Like this is not a big deal. Like don't stress at all. Like we do this. This is not a
Yeah.
problem. Trying to relay that you're able to handle, even if after the episode's done recording, then it's going to be a pain in the butt for you and for the team. And we're all going to have to spend more time and energy on it. At least the guest will come off better in the interview. And at the end of the day, that's what matters.
Yeah. Yeah. Reminding people that stuff can be fixed in post is definitely a helpful one. I see a lot of our shows doing that when something, gets flubbed, or even pausing the recording for a minute and being like, hey, let's just, take a pause. No big deal. Like they'll stitch it together later, like just letting them know that this is not like, pressure's off for a minute. We're not, no timers here. So like that can be helpful to reset. We're just in a couple minutes left, so I'll do one quick question, and then I think Mathew maybe actually this is a good one that comes up a lot. How long should an interview be?
Uh,
Because
I
I
was
don't think there's a right or wrong answer here necessarily, but I do have some thoughts about like some options. Mathew, what do you see? What do you tell people when they ask you this?
I wasn't sure we were going to get to this, so I was actually
Yeah,
typing up a response
yeah,
to Tess.
yeah,
I'll finish it for you just so you have it. But I love this question. I get it I used to get it 1,000
yeah.
times. everyone's going to say it's like, oh, 34 minutes or 29 minutes or 47 minutes because of the commute, the workout, blah, 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 blah.
It can't be more than 59 minutes and 59 seconds. Yeah,
yeah,
no.
no. If you want a time constraint, go do radio, right? They are all about the clock. The answer is, as long as it takes to deliver value for your audience without getting repetitive or boring. If it takes you 23 minutes to get that done, don't go 24 minutes. If it takes you 3 hours to get that done, don't cut it off at 59 minutes. Some of the clients of TPC did 3-hour episodes every week, and they were some of the most downloaded episodes across the entire catalog of clients. I don't think the audience craves 3 hours of content, but if you are having a conversation that can span for 3 hours, it has got to be interesting. No boring people talk to each other for 3 hours.
It's hard to guide a conversation for 3 hours. I mean, to be perfectly honest, I think you have to be a very strong host as well as have done a lot of research, and have a good guest on the other side.
Yeah. So I mean, it's just
ever do 3 hours.
So it's just like accomplish your goal, right? If you set this is the value I said I'm going to set out, however long it takes to do that, do it. If you are a business show and you're strictly informational, don't waste 20 minutes telling me about your cat. If you're an entertainment show and the idea is for you to, build a relationship with us, then yes, tell me about your cat. Don't talk to me about the technicalities of running a podcast. We don't care. So just it really, you have to think about your audience.
Yeah.
My point would be to be consistent over time. Like, I don't think you need to be 59 minutes every episode or 60 minutes every episode, but I would say I wouldn't do 4-hour episode this week and then 20-minute episode next week.
Sure.
Like, I would try to be in the ballpark over time, consistent, but I also think like we'll have episodes that are 2 hours long and are the most downloaded and super interesting. And if we have a guest where they record for 90 minutes and there's not as much good content, we'll cut a lot out. And that's okay, because it sounds better for the guest anyway. And half the time they don't want to listen to it afterwards. But, I think if an answer falls flat, cut it. Like, don't just keep it in for some artificial time limit. If you ask me how long an episode was of any other show, I wouldn't be able to tell you because I don't care.
Well, the audience has no idea what was taken out.
Right. Yeah. Yep. Well, we could probably talk for 3 hours because we could geek out on a million different little variations of this topic, but I will put a pin in this for today. Thanks so much, everybody, for joining. Mathew and Colby, sign us off. Colby, where can people find out more about you or follow up or questions? Anything out there you'd share?
So I have no professional affiliation with these guys besides working with them. So I'm not a part of them, but I'll say anytime anyone reaches out to me, I'm like, the first thing you need to do is hire them, because if this isn't your cup of tea, it's a lot to get overwhelmed with. But I'm happy to talk to people if you want to, because I appreciated when people did that with me when I was getting started too, besides them. So you can just pull me up on LinkedIn. That's probably the easiest way. My email is also CD. I'll put it in the chat here. cdonoff35@gmail. But you can pull me up on LinkedIn. I can't imagine there's too many of me.
Cool. Thanks, Colby. I appreciate that and appreciate the good word. Mathew, I know you're working on a new thing now, so tell us a little bit about what you've got going on and how people can reach out to you.
Yeah, I mean, easiest way to find me, if you just Google the name Mathew Passy, one T Mathew, no E and Passy, you'll find me. These days working on podcastingtech.com, place for studio tours and tech spotlights here in the world of podcasting. And we're also putting out custom podcast studios. So if you've been thinking about putting together a real fancy studio or something in your office or something you really want to impress guests and your audience, we can do whatever you want, even as far as putting in walls and hanging things in the ceiling and whatnot, like fully customizable.
Cool. Love it. Yeah. Looking forward to seeing how that continues to progress as you're building it out and figuring out all the different packages and working with you on that more. And then great to have everybody here. Obviously, you can follow up with us at thepodcastconsultant.com, and I'm Karl, Karl, at thepodcastconsultant.com. If you ever have questions about podcasting, or you're interested in getting started, or you want tips as a host, or you just want some direct feedback, always feel free to email me. Love listening to new shows and hearing what you got going on. We will send over follow-up at some point for everybody who attended and registered, as well as the video at some point. I don't know the timeline from the marketing team, but probably within the next week or two. And thanks so much for joining. Great to see everybody here. We'll see you next time.
Thanks, everybody.
Take care.
Thanks, y'all.